Hey everybody, hope you're doing well and safe, and praying for you guys. Hope that you're able to stay home and be able to get and have access to be able to watch these videos, so you can stay up with what we're doing. But continuing on, First, Second Corinthians, kind of going to talk a little bit about Corinth and Paul. Corinth was the largest, one of the most prosperous cities in Greece. Its capital, Achaia, had a population of about 300 to 500,000 people. It was located on an isthmus in the northern Greece. Had two seaports, and a lot of times they would load off cargo from one to the other. Corinth hosted the Isthmian Games. Every 2 years they would have these games, kind of like Olympic Games. In the first century, though, Corinth was known as kind of being an immoral cesspool that was synonymous with the word was synonymous with an immoral lifestyle. If you were to Corinthianize, was to corrupt someone. So to call someone a Corinthian was to imply that really they didn't have a whole lot of morals. At Corinth, there was a sizable Jewish community there. Paul first came to Corinth near the end of his second missionary trip. That's chapter 18 of Acts. Stayed with Aquila and Priscilla about 18 months there. Then he returned to his home in Antioch. And on a third missionary trip, he spent 3 years in Ephesus, during which he picked up the thread of contact with the Corinthians. And so I'll kind of give you the rundown of this letter. There's two other letters that are kind of at work in the dialogue with the Corinthians and Paul. So basically, in 1 Corinthians 5:9, Paul mentioned a previous letter. So it was his first letter that we don't have. He was warning believers not to associate with the immoral in that letter. They mistakenly took him to mean that they should have no contact at all with Christians. So 1 Corinthians kind of corrects that. 1 Corinthians 5, verse 9 through 11. I believe that's the passage that talks about being all things to all people. But at Ephesus, Paul heard from Corinth. The congregation sent a letter. 1 Corinthians 7 says, asking about certain issues troubling the church, and the messengers that brought the letter to the apostle filled him in about problems with division and this ugly sin that was of the sexual nature. So Paul wrote 1 Corinthians kind of in light of that, sent Timothy with that letter, 1 Corinthians, to deliver it to them. Know that from 1 Corinthians 4:17, but Paul's letter and Timothy's visit didn't solve the problems. Instead, the situation gets worse. Paul made a quick trip, it seems, to Corinth to kind of get things right. And that proved to be a painful visit. It was not well received. Paul tried to rebuke perhaps the man who was having sexual relations with his stepmother. And thus, chapter 5 kind of speaks to the apostles' authority was attacked by this person, and the congregation entered a kind of a conspiracy silence. Didn't really come to Paul's defense. So he went back to Ephesus. From Ephesus, Paul wrote a painful letter. Now, this is another one that we don't have. Previous letter we don't have. And then you see 1 Corinthians is written, and then next is this painful letter, over which he, quote, sheds many tears. 2 Corinthians 3:4-11 talks about it. With it, he meant to straighten out the problems at Corinth. The description of this missive that happened in chapter 7, verse 8-13 fits neither the letter referred to in 1 Corinthians nor 1 Corinthians itself. So it seems to have been a separate letter, probably delivered by Titus. Paul couldn't wait at Ephesus for a reply, so he left and went to Macedonia to find Titus and get a report. Titus brought good news. The church had disciplined the defiant individual, broken his arrogance. He had even repented. Paul wrote 2 Corinthians to express his relief, to urge the congregation to restore the repentant man and to deal with a new opposed false prophet that was possibly coming on the scene. This letter Paul sent with Titus to Corinth with word that the apostle would also come again soon. So Paul did winter at Corinth before taking the collection on to the poor believers in Jerusalem. That final visit he described as kind of a third visit in 2 Corinthians 12, verse 14. The biggest problem with kind of these letters and interpretation has to do with like correspondence to the Corinthians. Some people say the present letters are not single but continuous letters. They weren't single continuous letters, but they're a collection of letters written separately and then kind of spliced together even to produce documents. Some conservatives actually hold that view, but I think there's a lot of reasons to not hold that view. I think probably the parsonary theories, that's what they're called, those who believe that these are spliced together, haven't convinced the majority of scholars. There's really not any manuscript evidence to support 1st or 2nd Corinthians circulating in a form different from the present canonical version. So there's thus, I don't think, really a compelling reason to suppose that 1st or 2nd Corinthians is a composite work. Both the previous and the painful letters are no more, but we do have these two letters, 1st and 2nd Corinthians. Very few question Paul is the author of these. The external evidence strong, as well as internal. You have Paul saying that he's the author. He calls himself that in chapter 1 and chapter 16 of 1 Corinthians. 2 Corinthians is the same. External evidence is pretty strong there among early Christian writers. Internal evidence as well. The writer calls himself at the beginning of the text by name. Chapter 1 also ends with it in chapter 10. Very, very little reason why not to think that Paul is the writer of these two letters. 1 Corinthians' purpose. Paul's purposes are clear. He wanted to correct the problems brought to him by word of mouth, to answer questions raised in the letter to him, and announce his plan to visit them later. I would say the theme for 1 Corinthians is correcting church problems. Correcting church problems. That's the theme. All right. What are some points of interest? In 1 Corinthians, you have this chapter 12 through 14 that talk a good deal about spiritual gifts. Some distinguish sharply between a talent and a spiritual gift. Paul never really raises the issue. In these chapters, he indicated every believer has at least one gift. No believers have exactly the same gifts. No one gift should be exalted over other gifts, and that all gifts work together for the health and growth of the body, the church. Unless gifts are used in an attitude of love, they are worthless. That's made abundantly clear in chapter 13. Even in the first century, the spectacular gift of tongues provoked controversy, though. We see that in chapter 14. God's gifts should follow God's rules, and they're laid out pretty clearly there in the book of Corinthians. 1 Corinthians also, another point of interest, it contains an important chapter, chapter 15. It's on the resurrection, that of Jesus, his resurrection, but not only Jesus, also the resurrection of believers is mentioned and discussed by Paul in chapter 15. Chapter 3, 1 Corinthians, also a key chapter on giving. Sets forth the period that persons, each one of you is what he says, the place set aside to the temple, the proportion as he may prosper, the purpose to prevent the need for special collections. And also protection. Chapter 8, verse 19, shows each church that gave sent a man to help carry the offering to Jerusalem. The funds were handled by more than one man and never by the preacher. Something to keep in mind. If you ever want to be a preacher, don't touch the money, okay? I definitely try not to do that. Another thing, though, the question of meats. Chapter 8, verse 1 through 11, chapter 11, exposed three principles to use to judge questionable issues. For example, these things are like personal liberty, the good of a brother, and the glory of God. How do these things work together? in dealing with issues that we have, maybe moral issues and ethical issues. First of all, no believer should attempt to command the conscience of another. That's what we mean by personal liberty. Secondly, the good of the brother, no believer should misuse his personal liberty in loose living that will mislead a follower or a fellow Christian. That's what's meant by doing things for the good of your brother. And thirdly, the glory of God. Each believer should make sure his every deed glorifies God. Whether you eat, whether you drink, do it all for the glory of God. Pretty significant when we talk about ethics and things like that. And certainly the Corinthians needed a lesson on that. Clearly, Paul considered his words taught by the Holy Spirit. Chapter 2, verse 13. It's in light of this claim that his readers must understand Paul's statement that his words are his own rather than the Lord's. This language, that happens in chapter 7, verse 6, and also chapter 7, verse 10 and verse 12. Language did not imply that he was merely giving his opinions, but only that he could not quote Jesus on these points, and therefore gave his own Spirit-inspired teaching as one who is trustworthy. Chapter 7, 25, and chapter 7, verse 40 indicate that. 1 Corinthians 15, the first 4 verses, massively important. I'd encourage. I memorized a couple verses here. It talks about how these define the gospel found in Paul's writings. Not everything is the gospel, but this is the gospel of salvation: that Jesus died, that he was buried, and that he rose again. Are all part of the gospel. For some reason, it doesn't look like the screen's working, but I'm going to finish these last couple of thoughts here. It says, last thing, seventh thing kind of here. Boltman argued that the view of Jesus as divine was a later development in Greek Christianity, not original to Jesus himself or to the early church. He said Paul and his Hellenistic church converted Jesus from a simple Jewish prophet into a divine Savior. According to Boltman, it was in Antioch Jesus was first called Lord and his disciples first called Christians. The Achilles heel of this theory of evolving Christology is 1 Corinthians 16:22. It's the word Maranatha, an Aramaic expression that can be rendered Maranatha, the Lord has come, or Maranatha, O Lord, come. Mar is Aramaic for Lord. That Paul should use an untranslated Aramaic expression in a letter to a Greek-speaking church that knew no Aramaic proves that the use of Mar, Kurios, for Jesus started in the primitive church before Paul's day. The expression also shows the hope of Jesus' return was part of the original faith of the church. So those are some things to keep in mind. I'm going to close off here and pick up 2 Corinthians in another video right after this one. Thank you, guys.